All right. Well, hi, I'm Terry Markham with Uprising, and we are doing a social media series this month for National Human Trafficking Awareness Month called It's All Connected. So, we're reaching out to some different voices in the human trafficking field and talking to them about issues that are related to human trafficking but aren't necessarily human trafficking. So, today we have Megan Lundstrom with us. She is an awesome voice in this movement. She is the co founder and director of research for the Avery Center, and she is very well versed on our topic today, which is substance abuse. She actually even teaches whole classes about how substance abuse intersects with trafficking. So we're really excited to have you. Thank you for
Thank
being
you.
here. Why don't we
Thanks.
start with you? Just tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you became such an amazing voice in this movement.
Yeah, so I am a survivor of domestic sex trafficking. I exited in 2012, and there were no resources for women like me in my community. And not just were there no resources, but there was so much stigma around some of my experiences and how I showed up in the community, that it made it really hard to find help, find support, and really get stabilized and get out of that situation. So as I continued on my own healing journey, I started speaking publicly, and pretty quickly was like, there's no way I'm the only person in this community that has experienced these things. And sure enough, I started just at speaking engagements. People would come up to me and say, I think I know somebody, I have a family member, or somebody in our church congregation, or we have a client, who can I refer them to? And it was so upsetting to say, like, there's nothing. So that was really the point that I realized I needed to do something in my own community. So I founded what was originally Free Our Girls back in 2014, and we just went through a name change this year to the Avery Center. So we offer direct services to victims and survivors of human trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. Our core program is an economic empowerment program. So we have a job program, but we also offer peer support groups, intensive case management, a whole bunch of other amazing projects and services, and ways that we support individuals on their own journeys. And then I have transitioned this year into really strongly into research. I've always done research kind of behind the scenes, but that is really becoming my primary role over this past year.
Yeah, that's awesome because research is something I feel like there's not a whole lot of in our field. So it's exciting that we have you guys who are out there doing research. And I think I just saw, I think it was this morning on Facebook, to toot your horn a little bit. You were talking about how there was actually 18 employees of the Avery Center, I believe. 17 of them are survivors and they're women. And so that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's been an amazing year. And, we're doing all of our tax documents because it's January and we're doing all that fun right now. But it was such a fun kind of thing to look back on over this past year and think about, not only are we serving survivors in all of our direct services, but we're actually directly employing a huge group of individuals who are just powerhouses, and the Avery Center wouldn't be able to do what we do if we didn't have those folks on our team.
That's so awesome. All right, so let's dive into a little bit more about substance abuse, which is our topic today.
Sure.
I know you and I've had some conversations in the past, and you shared some interesting things about substance abuse and how it related to where you lived and where you grew up. And so just tell me a little bit about your history with substance abuse.
Sure. So I will first and foremost acknowledge I do not have a history with substance use disorder. It's been something that I grew up around. Weld County here in Colorado, the year I think I graduated high school, had the highest number of meth labs in the nation. So I definitely grew up exposed to substance use disorders, around illicit substances, was very aware that it was happening, was exposed to a lot of substance abuse during my trafficking, but didn't, it just was not a part of my personal journey. So definitely saw a lot of it. When I first founded the Avery Center, I really didn't know myself what to expect in my community because I was trafficked primarily in big cities and across the country, but I had not been trafficked specifically up here in northern Colorado, really not really much at all. And so I wasn't sure what we were going to expect to see when we started getting referrals. And I was just absolutely heartbroken when we started getting referrals to see, I think probably 95% of the clients that come to us are either in active addiction or in their own journey to recovery. So that intersection with substance use is so huge. And I think it's really important to talk about. It's something that I really like talking to service providers, law enforcement, healthcare specifically, because a lot of times folks with mental health issues or substance use disorders get labeled as like the frequent flyers, and they get dismissed. They kind of get pushed to the side. They get ignored. They just due to the cycle of addiction, exhaust resources, and so then they get turned away. They get criminalized for their addiction, and it just becomes incredibly difficult for them to ever be able to exit and find long-term stability. So I love talking with professionals, and just with the hopes of shifting that perspective to understand a little bit better what is happening to folks with substance use disorders, but particularly where that intersection of vulnerability to sex trafficking comes in, I think is really important for providers, service providers to be understanding that and to be doing intakes and assessments with folks that incorporate questions around experiencing exploitation.
What are some of the ways that you've maybe seen substance abuse play a role in some of these survivors? Because I imagine that sometimes substance abuse was something introduced before their trafficking might have started. And I've also heard survivors who say substance abuse was introduced during their trafficking as part of it. So tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I actually did a study and I just submitted it for peer review a couple weeks ago. Finally, it took me about a year to write it up, but finally got it submitted. And we did 54 qualitative interviews back in 2017 with individuals who were really all along the spectrum of commercial sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. So individuals who had never had a third-party facilitator, individuals who were trafficked as children and continue to remain trapped in the sex trade after they turned 18, individuals who were trafficked but then were able to escape their trafficker but again stayed trapped in the commercial sex trade, individuals who were completely exited, just the full spectrum. And so we didn't ask questions specifically about substance use, but it came up again and again and again in these interviews. So I looked at, I think it was a sample of about 25. So about 50% of them just openly talked about substance use and the intersection with their experiences in the commercial sex trade. And so I looked at that sample and divided it out into types of third-party traffickers. So looked at familial trafficking, gang trafficking, and pimp-controlled trafficking. And I was really curious to know, do all traffickers use the same tactics with substance use disorders in their victims, or does it look different based on the typology of the trafficker? And there's actually some really marked, huge differences in how traffickers use substances to maintain control over their victims. So in familial situations, Familial can kind of be further divided out into individuals who are part of a high demand group, so typically like a cultic group or a very religious group. And then individuals who are trafficked by a family member or introduced to a trafficker by a family member because that family member has a history of substance use themselves. And so the child is then sold for drugs or to pay off a drug debt. So that with familial, those are the two. Obviously, individuals who are perhaps sold to a drug dealer or sold because their parent has a substance use history, they are exposed to substances and oftentimes do use substances over their exploitation. Sometimes it's forced on them. Sometimes it is a coping skill. Individuals who are in these high demand groups, typically because it has that religious component, and substances broadly are frowned upon within most of those groups. So that population of victims really doesn't have access to substances the way that other populations of trafficking victims do. When we looked at gang and pimp control, so that was the largest piece of our sample, gang controlled victims oftentimes already had an existing substance use disorder when they were recruited by the gang. And this makes sense when you think sociologically about what's happening is gangs are selling people, so they're trafficking people, but they're also drug trafficking as well at the same time. And so when you have a person who is paying for and consuming substances and they're being sold by that gang, they double the profits. And so it's actually profitable for that gang to maintain that substance use with that victim. And then that victim also then introduces clients and customers of theirs to the gang for substances as well. So it's all this like profit. It's all just generating money for that gang, and it's very profitable. And so gangs are target people with existing substance use disorders more likely. Gangs are extremely brutal when it comes to their tactics. So they use extreme physical force, forced drug use. They utilize waiting for a victim to go into withdrawals and then make them do things in order to get that next high and to avoid those withdrawal symptoms. When you look at pimp-controlled sex trafficking, it's very different from gang-controlled. Pimp-controlled, because it is framed typically within the context of either a business relationship or an intimate partner relationship, that's where you're going to see this like social introduction of substances. So a lot of times traffickers, pimp traffickers will target individuals who don't already have a substance use disorder. They may develop one over time as a coping skill or because they're socially coerced into taking substances with their trafficker or before they're sent out for the night. And so an addiction forms over time. Pimp traffickers really use substances to essentially fuel the trauma bond between the victim and their abuser, which is a really fascinating component because when you have substances wrapped up in that trauma bond, a trauma bond in itself is almost addicting in a sense. So you have this like double layered addiction. So when you look at gang controlled victims, they typically tend to struggle with substance use disorder more long term. So even after escape or exit, pimp controlled trafficking victims, typically once that trauma bond was broken, they were able to get clean and stay cleaner for longer periods of time than compared to gang controlled victims. So lots of nuances and lots of differences, and so important to understand that it's going to show up so differently. It's not just one specific way that it always looks.
Yeah, that's like layers and layers and layers.
Yeah.
Ways that this intersects. Why is it so important that we are having conversations about it? Why do we need to know about all of these intersections?
I think, obviously, the more we know, the better jobs we can do, whatever field we're in or however we're connected to anti-trafficking work. I think it's really important, like if folks are more on a prevention side of things, recognizing that somebody that already has a substance use disorder is at risk for trafficking, but also recognizing that folks that don't have a substance use disorder, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not at risk for trafficking. So I think those nuances are really important to take into consideration. And it can also really help with determining treatment plans. So understanding the typology of the trafficker and how that intersects with the substance use disorder is really going to help. Say somebody is referred to a diversion or a treatment program, it's going to be really important to understand how that substance use connects with that trafficker. And if, for example, with the pimp control, if there's a trauma bond that's still there, they're probably going to have a relapse. And vice versa. If there's not a trauma bond there, they're probably going to be able to stay clean for a longer period of time and be able to focus more on kind of that next, like on Maslow's hierarchy, kind of those next steps of establishing stability in their life.
It sounds like it's really prominent and common that you would have a substance abuse issue in a lot of trafficking cases. So is there sort of, as we're learning more, is there best practices sort of that we need to be having substance abuse like recovery and treatment as part of human trafficking recovery and treatment as well?
Absolutely. And I think kind of it goes both ways. So if there is a recovery or treatment program, they need to be screening and offering services specifically around commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking. If there's a court program or mandated program, or even just a self opt-in program for recovery, understanding what that intersection looks like. And I think it even goes beyond that into kind of those next steps of a survivor's life. So recognizing that relapse is probably going to happen. That's a part of long-term recovery, is figuring out what works. And as humans, we don't have an instruction manual of how to do life right the first time. We learn by what we refer to as messing up. And making mistakes and tripping and falling and revising things. And it's no different when it comes to substance use recovery. So at the Avery Center with our job program, we recognize that substance use relapse is a part of the journey to learning coping skills and building relationships with people that you can trust and identifying people you can't trust. And so we look at the model, the stages of change model, which is really important to understand that, again, like it's a part of the process. And when you shame people or exit them from programs because they relapse, they're more than likely going to end up experiencing re-exploitation. And it does nobody any good. So making sure that program models are built to acknowledge that substance use relapse is gonna happen. And having open doors for when it does happen. I still want you to come in and check in with me. And I want to make sure that you have food, you have somewhere safe to sleep tonight, you've had a shower, all of those things. And we will, revisit next steps when you're ready and able to do so.
That makes sense. Do you think that also crosses over if someone is dealing with a loved one who's struggling, that it's sort of the same analogy there?
Absolutely. I think it's so hard. I have a family member who has struggled with addiction for almost 20 years. And so seeing the hurt and damage that has caused our family, it's heartbreaking to be a family member that you want so much for that person, and you see how much they are capable of, and just the wreckage that addiction causes. And so it can be really easy to blame that person and point the finger at them and socially ostracize them. And it's this fine balance of how do you have firm and healthy boundaries with somebody while make sure they're safe, but also recognizing what addiction is and how it plays out and what people ultimately need so that they can get clean and stay clean long term.
Wow. Yeah, it's a lot. Well, so if someone out there is, where can they go? The Avery Center, you guys are set up to work with victims and help them along this struggle, and you're in Northern Colorado. Do you know of any other resources, maybe at a national level, that would be good ones to seek out?
Sure. Yeah, I would say Polaris, the National Human Trafficking Hotline, we work a lot with them, both from the service side, but then I also contract with them for research, which is super cool. And so I cannot speak highly enough of Polaris. I just think they're great people, great organization, so many connections to resources. And they are so open to feedback from survivors about how their services are being delivered and constantly wanting to improve on what they're doing. I would say Rebecca Bender initiative, she has Elevate Academy, and she created Elevate because she lived in a rural area, and she was like, you can't build an entire organization to serve a rural area. It's just not accessible for most people. And so she envisioned something online, a virtual academy, so survivors could access support and mentorship and professional development. So I've gone through a ton of Rebecca's courses on Elevate. The Avery Center wouldn't be where we are today without Elevate really helping me figure out what do I want to do, what am I good at, and how do I go about making a plan that is realistic that I can stick with, and having that support. And then I think those are the two like national ones. I would say the Avery Center, we do have services local to Northern Colorado, but the silver lining of COVID has been that we have rolled 100% of our programs remote. So they are nationally accessible too. So our peer support groups, case management, we do have some telehealth, depends on the state and where our therapists are able to serve. And then we also have half of our job program positions are remote too. So those are just a few options at the national level.
Wow, that's huge. That's
Yeah.
great to hear because we're here in Wyoming. So, I mean, as a state, we're pretty rural, and
Yeah.
that's one thing we really, I think, as we're learning as a state more about human trafficking and getting more awareness, I expect that more survivors will realize that there are resources that they can access, even though we don't have any human trafficking specific victim services in our state at this
Sure.
point. So that's amazing. Well,
Yeah.
awesome. Is there anything else you think we need to know before we let you go? I feel
Um,
like we covered a lot.
yeah, I would say, yeah, thank you for having me on. And to folks that are listening, continue listening to survivors. Those with lived experience have been there. We've walked those paths, and it's so important to hear our voices and have our voices contribute to projects just like this one, so that our communities are really getting equipped with the information that's relevant, and that they can take back with them and put into action in their communities. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your time.